Okay, welcome everybody. In this video, I want to talk about the pivot longer function from the tidyr package. And this is perhaps one of the most useful functions in the tidyr package for taking non-tidy, messy data and cleaning it up, putting it into a tidy fashion. And so I think the best way to kind of illustrate and discuss how these functions work is to work through examples. So let's kind of consider this table for A. In this table for A, you would need to load the tidyverse in order to access this table for A. So if you are just opening up this Colab notebook for the first time, just be sure you run the library tidyverse command to access these tables. But if you're looking at this table, we've seen it in an earlier module. We commented that this was not tidy data. Um, and what we're looking at here are tuberculosis cases in countries in Afghanistan, Brazil, and China in the years 1999 and 2000. And if you're looking at this data set, we said like the first thing that you would want to do in this process of tidying up data is first think about what are the variables and what are the observations in your in the end product, right? What's your goal? So here, year would be a variable. So 1999 is not a variable. 1999 is a value of the variable year. 2000 is currently a column, right? But 2000 is actually not a variable. 2000 is a value of the year variable. So this is not organized in a right way. But you can see here how like somebody collecting data might think this is a reasonable way to structure the data set. This looks reasonable, but from our perspective, when we start to plot things inside of the tidyverse, having data stored in this way is not going to be convenient, and tidying it up into a form that we construct at the end of this exercise is going to work way more smoothly in the tidyverse when we're creating ggplots and doing our statistical analysis. Storing our data in a tidy fashion is going to be way more preferable than storing our data in this fashion that I'm looking at right now. So I would want to have a column that has country like we currently have. That's totally fine. I want to create a column that has year, and then I want to have a column that has cases, tuberculosis cases, that then takes all of these values that I'm looking at and combines them into one column. So that's what I talk about. That's what I mean by gathering columns. So I want to gather these two columns of values in 1999 and 2000 and group them into one column of cases, tuberculosis cases. And so as a result of that, that means for each country, we're going to have two rows. I'm going to have Afghanistan 1999, Afghanistan 2000. So each country, rather than have their data stored in one row, each observation is going to correspond to a country and an individual year. So we're going to have a total of 6 rows in the end. So our data set is going to be twice as long in the end. So that's what we mean by lengthening the data set. So as a result of combining those two rows, those two columns of data in 1999 and 2000, we're going to have to, if we're not going to lose any detail of information, we're going to have to double up the length of the data set in terms of doubling the number of rows in our data frame. And so down below is an example of what we would want to, how that would look like, at least the first couple of rows. This should be not 1999, but this would be 2000 over here. Okay, so let's kind of talk about how we would do that using the pivot longer function. So the inputs would be the data. So the data is currently being stored in table 4A. So that's what we want to tidy up. The columns that we want to gather values. So for us, that would be we want to gather values from the 1999 and the 2000 column. So that's what is going on this part of the code. And I could specify this to be more clear with calls. I don't need to write that there. The names too would be the column name for the column that the names of the gathered columns are placed. So in other words, these what is going to be the name for the column where I put 1999 and 2000, where I put the year. So that's where I put year over here. And then the values two is going to be the name of the column from where I put where the values are going to be gathered. So I'm going to call that cases. So I need to put a name for the column for where these values are going to go. So I'm going to store those. So these are going to indicate whether this value came from the 1999 column or whether the value originally came from the 2000 column. And we're going to call that column year. Otherwise, these values are going to be moved into a single column that we call cases. So I'll run this code cell and you can see this is exactly the output that we got. And this is now tidy data. This is going to work much nicer when we do some analysis in our treating year as a variable, as opposed to treating 1999 as a variable and 2000 as a variable. And we could just as well have used the pipe with this command. And instead of like entering table 4A as the first argument, I could have piped it into the pivot longer command. And just note that this option calls equal. We typically, oftentimes people will get lazy and not type calls equal since it's implied that those are the columns. Just like people will get lazy and not type data equals. It's kind of implied that the first argument is the data. So you can not type calls equal and just simply type a vector with all of the columns that you are going to combine. So this will produce exactly the same output. But what's important here is that notice the columns that I am combining, I did type them inside of double quotes when I listed them inside of this vector over here. And when I gave names to my new columns, years and cases, notice I did put those names inside of double quotes over here. So in the previous module, we were working with dplyr, and when we were indicating the column names, for the most part, we were not putting those column names inside of double quotes. When we're working with tidyr, these column names, when we're indicating them, are being put inside of double quotes. So just keep that in mind in the pivot longer function. Okay, so that is a wrap for our introduction to pivot longer. The next video will give you some practice. Thanks.